Before the Tsars, before the empire, before Russia had a name, it was a patchwork of rival cities, bound by faith, divided by ambition. They rang bells in their marketplaces. They held councils in their squares. They believed themselves heirs to something ancient, something whole. Then came the fire. From the edge of the world, a force arrived that neither parleyed nor paused. Cities fell, princes died, the map burned. And in the ruins, something new began to form. Not all that claimed to survive truly did. Not all that vanished was truly lost. This is the story of what endured, and what became powerful enough to erase the memory of everything else. At the dawn of the 13th century, a force emerged from the eastern steppe that would redraw the map of the known world. The Mongol Empire, forged by Genghis Khan, had already shattered kingdoms across Central Asia. By 1219, they had obliterated the Khwarezmian Empire, reducing cities like Samarkand and Bukhara to charred husks and silencing courts that had once ruled vast swathes of Persia and Central Asia. But this was only the beginning. As the Mongols pressed westward, their gaze turned to the lands beyond the Caspian, toward the Pontic steppe and the loosely connected principalities of the Rus. In 1223, the first contact came, not as an invasion, but as a probing strike, a reconnaissance in force. The generals Subutai and Jebe, two of Genghis Khan's most brilliant commanders, had been pursuing the Cumans, a Turkic nomadic people who had long dominated the southern steppes. The Cumans fled before them, westward, seeking protection from the princes of the Rus. It worked, at first. Alarmed by the threat from the east, a loose coalition of Rus's princes quickly formed. Among them were Mstislav of Kiev and Mstislav of Galicia, along with several others who brought their own retinues and levies. These princes had little experience fighting a unified enemy across the open steppe, but they knew their pride and their honor were at stake. The two sides met near the Kalka River, on the open plains north of the Black Sea. What followed was not a battle, it was a lesson. The Mongols feigned retreat, a tactic they had perfected over years of warfare. The Rus-Cuman coalition, eager and disorganized, gave chase. As their forces stretched thin across the steppe, Subutai and Jebe struck, fast, coordinated, and with devastating precision. The Rus' armies were divided and destroyed in detail, unable to regroup or respond. The aftermath was worse. The captured Rus' nobles, including both Mstislavs, were executed, not with swords, but beneath wooden planks. The Mongols laid them flat, placed boards over their bodies, and sat down to feast. The message was deliberate. Defiance would be crushed, slowly, beneath the weight of Mongol domination. And then, just like that, the Mongols vanished. To the Rus' princes who survived, it may have felt like a miracle. Their strange enemy had crushed them utterly, then ridden off without claiming a single city. No tribute was imposed, no territory was held. It was as if the nightmare had ended as suddenly as it began. But they had misunderstood the moment. This was no accident, no mercy. It was reconnaissance. The Mongols had come not to conquer, but to learn, to study the steppe, to test the strength of the Rus, to see how quickly their alliances fractured, how slowly they moved, how deeply they underestimated what was coming. A new kind of war driven by discipline, speed, and fear. 13 years later, in 1236, the Mongols began a full-scale western campaign. Under the command of Batu Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan, and with the strategic oversight of the great general Subutai, their first objective was the destruction of the Volga Bulgars to secure the eastern frontier. This was completed swiftly. By late 1237, the Mongols moved into the Rus lands proper. At this time, the Kievan Rus was not a single unified polity but a patchwork of principalities: Vladimir Suzdal, Kiev, Ryazan, Novgorod, Galicia and others, often in conflict with each other and incapable of unified defense. Across the snow-laden forests of the northeast, the air carried no birdsong, only the smell of ash and the silence left behind by slaughter. The Mongols had come like a blizzard, sudden and methodical, dismantling the world of the Rus city by city. Their first major target was Ryazan. The Mongols sent envoys demanding submission and tribute. The Prince of Ryazan, Yuri Ingvarovich, refused. The Mongols then besieged the city in December 1237. After 5 days of bombardment and fighting, the walls were breached. The city was burned to the ground, its population slaughtered or enslaved. The princely family was executed. Chronicles record this destruction in visceral terms. There was none left to groan or cry. Moscow was next. But Moscow was not yet Moscow. It was a small fortified post along the Moskva River, a wooden town dependent on the greater principality of Vladimir. It had no standing army, no wealth of note, no place to negotiate from. The Mongols reached its walls quickly. There was no offer made, no delegation sent. They breached the defenses in hours, burned the wooden towers, and killed everyone they found inside. It was neither a battle nor a siege. It was a punctuation mark in a campaign of annihilation. Not far beyond, the Grand Prince Yuri II tried to regroup. He left Vladimir and attempted to rally forces north of the Volga. But the Mongols, ever watchful, intercepted his army at the Sit River. There, in early March, Yuri's army was encircled and destroyed. The Grand Prince himself was killed in the melee, his body found decapitated, his authority decimated alongside him. With Vladimir burned and Moscow no longer more than embers, the northeastern heart of the Rus was silent, and the Mongols kept moving. To the northwest, tucked between frozen rivers and coniferous wilds, the city of Novgorod stood, cold, powerful, and deeply aware of the storm coming its way. It had watched the destruction unfold from a distance, messengers bringing tales of burning cities, butchered monks, children enslaved, ветch bells silenced in places that once rang with civic life. But Novgorod was different. It was a republic, of a kind. A merchant republic, ruled by a ветch assembly of nobles and citizens, with a prince chosen more as a military contractor than a sovereign. Its wealth came from fur, wax, and long-distance trade, stretching across the Hanseatic world. It had never been a military power. It had been a diplomatic one. And when word reached the city that Torjok had fallen, and the Mongols were just days away, the people of Novgorod gathered in emergency assembly. The city could resist. They had walls, soldiers, winter stores, but they also had foresight. They had watched what resistance had purchased in Ryazan, in Kolomna, in Vladimir. The choice was made quickly. They would not fight. They would submit. Envoys were sent. Gold, hostages and messages of submission were dispatched to Batu Khan's army. What was offered is not recorded in detail, but the effect is known. The Mongol army stopped. After destroying Torjok, they did not march on Novgorod. The reasons were pragmatic but decisive. Novgorod had not defied them. It had submitted swiftly, without conditions, and offered value without cost. From the Mongol perspective, the campaign had already accomplished its goals: political domination, psychological devastation, and submission of the northeast. Novgorod's survival served as the counterexample to the ashes of Ryazan. The message was clear: obedience would be rewarded with mercy, if not freedom, and so Novgorod survived. Not by divine intervention or impassable mud, but by the choice to submit. This was not the end of Mongol pressure. Over the next decades, Mongol census agents would arrive, tribute would be collected, and Novgorod would be yoked to the horde like the others. But it had preserved something unique: its people, its ветch, its political memory. It retained continuity. The voice of the Rus still rang in Novgorod, even as it was silenced elsewhere. Out of the scorched fields where the Mongols had passed, new cities began to rise, slowly, cautiously. And from the ruins of Muscovy, a new city arose. It was rebuilt not by independence, but by permission. The Mongols now ruled this land in fact, if not in presence. In the 1250s, they began issuing yarliks, charters granting princely rights to local rulers who pledged loyalty, paid tribute, and enforced Mongol will. The princes of Moscow, especially after the rise of Daniel, son of Alexander Nevsky, understood the new game. They did not resist the horde. They did not seek distance from it, as Novgorod had. Instead, they partnered with it. Moscow became an efficient tributary. It collected not only its own payments, but increasingly served as a collector for others. The princes learned to read the politics of Sarai, the capital of the Golden Horde. They cultivated trust, crushed rival cities when given license, and expanded under the protection of Mongol power. Muscovy was born in destruction, and then grew in collaboration. The 14th century opened with two very different visions of Rus coexisting uneasily. In the northwest, Novgorod remained a singular phenomenon, a merchant republic in a world increasingly ruled by princely power. Governed by the ветch, a civic assembly of nobles and townspeople, Novgorod was wealthy, educated, and stubbornly independent. Its prince was no sovereign. He was an employee, subject to dismissal if he overstepped. And its eyes were turned outward, to trade with the Hanseatic League, to dealings with Sweden and Lithuania, to the forests and fur-rich lands stretching into the Arctic. In the heartland, Muscovy was rising. It had no vesh, no tradition of civic freedom. What it had was ambition, a clear chain of princely succession, and a growing claim to be the inheritor of all the Rus lands. Its princes had become expert courtiers of the horde, securing yarliks for themselves and undermining rivals. The Mongols, ever pragmatic, rewarded loyalty with authority. And no one was more loyal or more cunning than the House of Moscow. As the 14th century unfolded, this difference turned to rivalry, and then to destiny. In the early 1300s, the main contest was not yet Novgorod versus Moscow, but Tver versus Moscow. Tver was older, more established, and a more plausible center for Rus unification. Its princes also had Mongol favor, but Ivan I of Moscow, Kalita, Moneybag, outmaneuvered them. Ivan presented himself as the most obedient vassal to the horde, and in 1328 he secured the role of Grand Prince of Vladimir. A symbolic title, but one that granted the right to collect tribute from all other Rus princes. This was a turning point. Tver resisted and was crushed with Mongol backing. Moscow had just learned how to weaponize obedience. The Mongols saw it as a reliable collector. Other Rus cities saw it as a tool of foreign tyranny, but it worked. And all the while, Novgorod watched, concerned but secure. By the mid-14th century, the Rus world stood at a crossroads, split not just by geography, but by political vision. In the northwest, Novgorod remained a republic of merchants and nobles, a polity ruled by its vesh and held together by consensus, negotiation, and outward-facing diplomacy. In the northeast, Muscovy was consolidating power, becoming not merely another principality, but the nucleus of a new kind of state. Novgorod rejected the idea that Moscow could speak for all Rus. It continued to choose its own princes, often outsiders, and actively cultivated ties with Lithuania and Poland. It tolerated Latin missionaries on its fringes and negotiated trade treaties in Latin and German. Its legitimacy was civic, legalistic, pragmatic. Moscow, by contrast, was incubating something more imperial. Having grown under Mongol favor, it now saw itself as the rightful center of Orthodox Rus. Its princes were not appointed. They were anointed by a divine and historical logic. But that logic had, until now, still been subject to Mongol permission. That changed in 1380. The Mongol world itself had fractured. The once unified Golden Horde was now a patchwork of competing khanates, their power decentralized and their loyalty uncertain. The Khan who led the campaign against Muscovy at Kulikovo was not from the old ruling line of Batu Khan, but a warlord named Mamai, a powerful Tatar commander based in the western steppe, aligned with the remnants of the Horde's Crimean branch. Mamai's position was precarious. He lacked full legitimacy among the Mongol elite and needed to reassert dominance over his vassals. To do this, he launched a campaign northward, ostensibly to enforce tribute, but in effect to conduct the kind of punitive raids that had become common from the Tatar frontier: extraction, terror, and slave-taking. Moscow saw the moment for what it was, not just a threat, but an opportunity. Under Grand Prince Dmitry Ivanovich, later called Donskoy, Muscovy rallied the princes of northeastern Rus to resist. This was unprecedented. Until now, defiance of the horde was suicidal. But Mamai's weakness gave Dmitry room to maneuver. The coalition that met Mamai's forces at the Don River was not simply Muscovite. It included forces from other Rus lands, even some from cities previously aligned with Tver or Novgorod. It was a Russian army. At the Battle of Kulikovo, Dmitry's forces won a bloody and hard-fought victory. Mamai's army was broken, and he was soon overthrown by a rival Mongol warlord, Toktamish, who would, ironically, return in 1382 and sack Moscow in revenge. So in strategic terms, the victory was temporary. But in symbolic terms, Kulikovo was transformational. It was the first time that Moscow had acted independently, not as a Mongol proxy, not as a tributary collector, but as a sovereign leader of a unified military force. The message was clear. Moscow could command not only Mongol favor, but now also Rus loyalty. And for the common people who had lived under the lash of Tatar raids and watched their kin taken as slaves to the markets of Crimea, this battle became a rallying cry. A sense of righteous anger began to take root, directed not just at Mamai, but at the entire legacy of Mongol domination. This was not yet liberation, but it was the beginning of memory. A memory that would be rewritten as destiny. Novgorod watched this shift with deepening concern. The Kulikovo victory was a rupture. It changed what Moscow was. It emboldened its claim to spiritual and national leadership. It created the myth of Moscow as defender, not collaborator. And by creating that dichotomy, Moscow undermined Novgorod's own foundational story. It had survived the Mongols not through defiance, but through discretion, by choosing submission over ruin. That path had preserved its autonomy, its vesh, its culture. But now that choice began to look, to some, like cowardice or irrelevance. Kulikovo planted a seed of legitimacy for Moscow that no trade treaty could match, and once planted, it would grow into the foundation of an empire. Into this growing tension stepped Ivan III, Grand Prince of Moscow, ascending in 1462. Tall, cold-eyed and patient, Ivan ruled without passion, but with total clarity. He had a singular goal: to unite the Rus lands under Moscow's hand. He believed that Muscovy was not just another principality, but the core of a restored Russian state. And to do that, Novgorod had to fall. At the start of his reign, he moved cautiously. He strengthened alliances. He married Sofia Palaiologina, a Byzantine princess, importing imperial prestige. He centralized Muscovite law. He expanded military capacity, and he waited. Meanwhile, Novgorod grew uneasy. It had tried to maintain its balancing act, allying with Casimir IV of Poland-Lithuania, hedging against Moscow's pressure. But this time, it miscalculated. The move gave Ivan exactly the pretext he needed. He accused Novgorod of betraying orthodoxy by courting Catholic powers. In 1471, Ivan led a campaign into Novgorodian territory. His forces met the Novgorodians at the Battle of Shelon River. The result was a massacre. The Vech militia had never been a professional army, and now, facing disciplined Muscovite troops, they broke. Thousands were killed. The Republic was forced to sue for peace, accept Ivan's terms, and pay heavy reparations. But Ivan was not done. He waited another 7 years, letting Novgorod stew in shame and debt. In 1478, he returned, not to punish, but to end. This time, there was no battle. The Muscovite army entered Novgorod unopposed. The Veche bell, symbol of the city's civic autonomy, was taken down and carried to Moscow. Ivan abolished the Vech, exiled the boyar elite, and redistributed their lands to Muscovite loyalists. Thousands of Novgorodians were forcibly relocated. The city's charter was dissolved. Its long republic was over. The last independent voice of the old Rus was silenced, not by Mongol swords, but by a Rus prince who had learned from the Mongols. The Mongol invasion did not merely devastate the early Rus world, it rewrote its future. In fire and tribute, it carved out a new political logic, one where power meant obedience, survival meant submission, and loyalty could be weaponized. What emerged from the ashes of Ryazan and the ruins of Vladimir was not just recovery, it was a transformation. Muscovy's rise was not in spite of the Mongols, but through them. The princes of Moscow, learning the grammar of empire from their Mongol overlords, mastered the art of centralized rule, fiscal extraction, and ruthless consolidation. The horde gave them both a template and a shield, a system where legitimacy came from above, and where authority was measured by one's ability to control others in the name of someone more powerful. This was the seedbed of Russian autocracy. When Ivan III took down the Veche bell of Novgorod, he was not merely ending a rival polity. He was silencing a different political idea, that power could be negotiated, shared, civic. In its place, he asserted something the Mongols had taught well, that the state must be singular, vertical, and total. The Veche may have been native to the Rus, but it was the Yalik that shaped the state. The legacy of the Mongol period thus lives on, not only in the chronicles of devastation, but in the structures of Russian governance. The vertical of power, the centralization of authority, the strategic use of submission as a tool of dominance, these were forged in the furnace of Mongol rule and tempered by Muscovy's ambition. Russia was not simply born from the collapse of Kievan Rus. It was baptized in the Mongol Yoke and matured in the shadow of its logic. And long after the horde faded, its methods endured, recast in orthodox robes bearing Slavic names, but unmistakably Mongol in their DNA.